The hook. Memory's deception. Have you ever been completely certain of a memory, only to discover it never actually happened? Picture this. You and your best friend from childhood are reminiscing about the time you both broke your neighbor's window playing baseball. You recall the panic, the confrontation, the punishment, every detail vivid in your mind. But then your friend looks puzzled. That wasn't me, they say. I wasn't even there that day. You argue, certain they're mistaken, until they show you a family photo album proving they were on vacation during that exact week. How could you remember something so clearly that never occurred? This isn't just an occasional glitch or random error. Memory researcher Elizabeth Loftus from the University of California, Irvine, has demonstrated that nearly 1/3 of us carry completely fabricated memories we would swear under oath are real. We have been taught that memory works like a video camera, recording events for later playback. We believe our memories are stored somewhere in our brains like files in a cabinet. We trust that important events, especially emotional ones, are preserved accurately. And we assume that forgetting is simply a failure to retrieve what is permanently etched somewhere in our neural circuits. Every single one of these assumptions is wrong, catastrophically wrong. And this gap between how memory actually works and how we believe it works has profound consequences for our legal system, for how we understand ourselves, and even for how we navigate our daily lives. What if I told you that every time you remember something, you are actually changing that memory? That the act of remembering itself destroys the original memory and creates a new one? That memories are not records of the past but predictions constructed in the present? These are not speculative theories but established scientific facts that have been known for decades, yet somehow never made it into your high school biology textbook. The setup. The birth of memory science. To understand how dramatically our understanding of memory has changed, we need to travel back to 1885, when a young German psychologist named Hermann Ebbinghaus made a breakthrough that would launch the scientific study of memory. In a small, dimly lit laboratory in Berlin, Ebbinghaus subjected himself to a grueling experiment. He memorized thousands of nonsensical syllables, strings like ZOF, WUB, and TAV, that had no meaning, no associations. He tested himself at various intervals to see how many he could recall. After years of these tedious self-experiments, Ebbinghaus produced what became known as the forgetting curve, a mathematical formula showing how memories decay over time. The curve was steep at first, we forget most information quickly, but then leveled off, some memories persist. It was the first quantifiable evidence that memory followed predictable patterns. The finding was revolutionary, suggesting memory could be studied objectively rather than through philosophical introspection. For the next several decades, memory research continued along similar lines. Scientists like Carl Lashley spent their careers searching for what they called the engram, the physical location in the brain where a specific memory is stored. Lashley systematically removed portions of rats' brains after they had learned to navigate mazes. His goal was simple: find where the maze memory was stored. But after decades of research and thousands of rat surgeries, Lashley had to admit defeat. In 1950, he famously concluded, "Learning is just not possible." Of course, learning is possible. What Lashley had discovered was that memories aren't stored in discrete locations. They're distributed throughout the brain. This was our first hint that the file cabinet model of memory was fundamentally wrong. The real revolution in memory science began in 1953 when Henry Molaison, known in the scientific literature as Patient HM, underwent experimental brain surgery to treat his epilepsy. Surgeons removed substantial portions of his medial temporal lobes, including a seahorse-shaped structure called the hippocampus. The surgery successfully reduced his seizures but left him with a profound amnesia. HM could no longer form new long-term memories. Each day, each conversation was new to him, even if it had happened just minutes before. Brenda Milner, a neuropsychologist who studied HM for decades, made a stunning discovery in 1962. While HM couldn't remember learning a motor task called the mirror drawing test, his performance improved each day. Somehow, he was learning without remembering that he had learned. This led to a fundamental distinction. Memory isn't one system but many. Declarative memory, facts and events we can consciously recall, operates differently from procedural memory, skills, and habits we perform automatically. But an even more revolutionary insight was brewing, one that would upend everything we thought we knew about how memories are formed, stored, and retrieved. The question that haunted researchers: if memory isn't simply stored like a file, what exactly is happening in our brains when we remember? The answer would prove far stranger than anyone had imagined. But before we venture into those waters, let's consider a question. Why does any of this matter? Beyond scientific curiosity, why should we care about the precise mechanisms of memory? In 1974, a devastating miscarriage of justice occurred that would highlight why understanding memory is so crucial. A man named Zachary Irwin was convicted of armed robbery based entirely on the eyewitness testimony of 5 people who picked him out of a lineup. The witnesses were absolutely certain. The jury was convinced. Zachary received a 20-year sentence. In 1992, DNA evidence exonerated him completely. He was innocent. How could 5 separate witnesses be so wrong about something they clearly remembered seeing? This case was not an anomaly. The Innocence Project has found that approximately 70% of wrongful convictions overturned by DNA evidence involved eyewitness misidentification. Our misunderstanding of memory has real-world consequences. It puts innocent people in prison. It disrupts families. It derails lives. Now let us delve deeper into the rabbit hole of how memory actually works, starting with a provocative question. What if everything you think you know about memory is not just slightly wrong, but fundamentally backward? The deepening mystery, memory as construction. In 1932, British psychologist Frederick Bartlett conducted an experiment that should have revolutionized our understanding of memory. He asked participants to read a Native American folk tale called The War of the Ghosts, and then recount it at various intervals, hours, days, or months later. What he found was astonishing. People didn't simply forget parts of the story, they actively transformed it. They rationalized unusual elements, emphasized details that fit their cultural expectations, and completely reimagined sections that didn't make sense to them. Bartlett concluded that remembering is not the retrieval of stored information but an act of reconstruction. We rebuild memories from fragments, filling gaps with assumptions, beliefs, and later experiences. Memory, he argued, isn't reproductive, it's reconstructive. His findings were largely ignored for decades. Why? Because they contradicted the dominant metaphor of memory as storage, a metaphor that aligned neatly with the emerging computer age. We were comfortable thinking of our brains as biological computers, with memories as files saved to a hard drive. But in the 1970s, cognitive psychologist Elizabeth Loftus began a series of experiments that would resurrect and expand Bartlett's insights. In her most famous studies, participants watched videos of car accidents and were later asked questions about what they saw. The phrasing of the questions dramatically affected their memories. When asked, how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other? Participants estimated much higher speeds than when asked, how fast were the cars going when they hit each other? A week later, those who heard smashed were far more likely to falsely remember seeing broken glass in the video, even though there was none. Loftus had demonstrated that memory is not just reconstructed but remarkably malleable. A single word could implant false details into what people believed they had witnessed. She pushed further. In a 1995 study, Loftus and her colleague Jacqueline Pickrell successfully implanted entire false memories in about 25% of their subjects. They convinced adults they had been lost in a shopping mall as children, an event that never occurred. The participants not only accepted this false memory, they elaborated on it, adding emotional details and specifics about how they felt during this non-existent experience. But the truly revolutionary discoveries about memory were happening at the cellular and molecular levels. In 1997, neuroscientist Joseph Ledoux made a discovery that would upend our understanding of memory at its most fundamental level. Working with fear memories in rats, Ledoux found that when animals recall a frightening experience, the memory becomes temporarily unstable. It enters what scientists call a labile state, where it can be modified before being stored again. This process is called reconsolidation. Think about the implications. Every time you remember something, that memory becomes vulnerable to change. When you recall that childhood birthday party, the act of remembering makes the memory briefly unstable. It's then reconsolidated, incorporating any new thoughts, feelings, or information present during the recall. The memory you put back is slightly different from the one you retrieved. And this happens every single time you remember. Memory, it turns out, isn't about preserving the past. It's about adapting to the future. Our brains aren't interested in perfect recordings. They're interested in useful information that helps us predict and navigate what might happen next. This explains why trauma survivors often experience flashbacks with increasing intensity over time, rather than fading memories. Each recall can strengthen the emotional content of the memory during reconsolidation. It explains why practicing retrieval, like self-quizzing, is more effective for learning than rereading material. The act of recall itself strengthens connections. And it explains why two people can experience the same event yet form entirely different memories. They're constructing, not recording. But if memories are so unreliable, how can we function at all? How can we trust anything we think we know? The answer lies in understanding what memory is actually for. And it's not what your teachers told you. Consider the case of Katerina Parkinson, who suffered damage to her retrosplenial cortex after a stroke in 2010. Her condition was unique. She could remember personal events from her past and could navigate familiar environments. But she couldn't do both simultaneously. She couldn't remember journeys she had taken, even ones she had traveled hundreds of times. She couldn't mentally retrace her steps from her house to the local grocery store, despite shopping there weekly for decades. Katerina's unusual deficit revealed something profound. One of memory's primary functions is to help us navigate space. This makes evolutionary sense. For our ancestors, remembering where food could be found, where predators lurked, and how to return to shelter was critical for survival. Remembering the details of a conversation from 2 weeks ago, not so much. This brings us to a revolutionary theory that has gained substantial evidence in recent years. Memory evolved primarily as a tool for prediction, not record-keeping. In 2017, neuroscientist Lisa Feldman Barrett proposed that our brains are essentially prediction machines. Rather than passively responding to sensory input, our brains constantly generate predictions about what we'll experience next, updating these predictions when they don't match reality. Memory, in this framework, provides the raw material for these predictions. This explains why our memories are so easily modified by subsequent information. They're not meant to be immutable records. They're meant to be useful guides for future behavior. When new information becomes available, our brains update our memories accordingly, sometimes without our conscious awareness. Consider this striking example. Volunteers in a study were shown a doctored photograph depicting them as children in a hot air balloon, an event that never happened. Initially, they correctly stated they had never been in a hot air balloon. But after repeated exposure to the fake photo, about 50% of participants began to remember details about this fictional event. Their brains were incorporating the photo into their autobiographical memories, creating a false past that aligned with this new evidence. But the most dramatic evidence for memory's predictive nature comes from cutting-edge neuroscience research using optogenetics, a technique that allows scientists to activate specific neurons using light. In 2019, researchers at MIT led by Susumu Tonegawa demonstrated that activating the same brain cells involved in encoding a fearful memory could make mice freeze in fear, even in completely safe environments. The same team later showed they could implant false memories by activating certain neuronal patterns while mice experienced something pleasant or unpleasant. These experiments revealed something profound. From the brain's perspective, there is surprisingly little difference between remembering and imagining. The same neural machinery is involved in both processes. This brings us to perhaps the most unsettling question of all. If our memories are continuously rewritten approximations rather than faithful recordings, is anything we remember actually real? And if not, what does that mean for our sense of self, which is built largely from our autobiographical memories? To answer these questions, we need to dive even deeper into the neuroscience of memory formation and the various systems that make up our memory apparatus. The turning point, memory systems and their purposes. The revolutionary insight about memory isn't just that it's reconstructive rather than reproductive. It's that memory isn't even a single system. It's a collection of specialized systems that evolved for different purposes, operating according to different rules. The most basic distinction is between explicit memory, things we consciously remember, and implicit memory, things that influence us without conscious awareness. But even this is just scratching the surface. Let's start with working memory, the system that allows you to hold and manipulate information temporarily. When you mentally calculate a tip at a restaurant or remember a phone number long enough to dial it, you're using working memory. This system, which relies heavily on the prefrontal cortex, is extremely limited. The classic paper by George Miller in 1956 suggested we can hold about 7 items, plus or minus 2, in working memory at once, though more recent research suggests the limit may be even lower, perhaps just 4 items. Working memory isn't just a temporary storage buffer, though. It's the system that allows us to maintain and manipulate conscious thought. It's where our mental life happens. And crucially, it's a bottleneck for forming long-term memories. If information never enters your working memory, if you never pay attention to it, it's unlikely to be remembered later. This explains why multitasking impairs learning so dramatically. When you divide your attention between a lecture and your phone, neither gets full access to working memory, and both experiences are encoded poorly, if at all. But long-term memory itself is subdivided into multiple systems. Declarative memory, information you can consciously recall and articulate, splits into semantic memory, facts and concepts, and episodic memory, experiences and events. These systems rely heavily on the hippocampus and surrounding structures. Non-declarative memory includes procedural memory, skills and habits, conditioning and emotional associations, largely managed by the amygdala, and priming effects, where exposure to one stimulus influences response to another. These systems operate in parallel but can also compete with each other. In a groundbreaking 2001 study, neuroscientists demonstrated that stress can shift the brain from using the hippocampus-dependent declarative memory system to the striatum-dependent habit system. This explains why we fall back on ingrained habits when stressed. Our brain literally switches memory systems. But perhaps the most surprising discovery about these memory systems is how little they actually care about accuracy. Consider the phenomenon of boundary extension, first documented by psychologists Helene Traub and Michael Richardson in 1989. When people view a close-up photograph and later try to remember it, they consistently remember seeing more of the scene than was actually shown. Their memory extends beyond the boundaries of the original image. This isn't a failure of memory. It's a feature. Our brains are automatically filling in what must have been there, creating a more complete representation that's useful for understanding our environment. Or consider the phenomenon of imagination inflation. When people merely imagine performing an action, crushing a Coke can, breaking a toothpick, they become more likely to remember having performed that action if asked about it later. The act of imagining creates memory traces similar to those formed by actual experience. These aren't random glitches. They reveal something fundamental about memory's purpose. Our brains prioritize creating coherent, useful models of the world over maintaining strict historical accuracy. Harvard psychologist Daniel Shatter has categorized memory's sins, the ways it systematically deviates from perfect accuracy. These include transience, forgetting over time, absent-mindedness, lapses of attention, blocking, temporary inability to retrieve information, misattribution, attributing memories to the wrong source, suggestibility, incorporating misleading information, bias, distortions reflecting current knowledge and beliefs, and persistence, unwanted recollections that won't go away. But Shatter argues these aren't design flaws, they're features that make memory adaptive for its true purpose, guiding future behavior. Forgetting irrelevant details prevents information overload. Generalizing across experiences helps us recognize patterns. Even false memories can be adaptive if they lead to useful behavior. This brings us to what may be the single most important insight about memory. It doesn't exist to record your life story. It exists to help you survive. Consider what happens during sleep. For decades, scientists believed sleep's role in memory was largely passive. It gave the brain time to consolidate the day's experiences without interference. But recent research using advanced imaging techniques reveals a much more active process. During slow-wave sleep, your brain essentially replays the day's important experiences, but not as a faithful recording. Instead, It extracts patterns and generalizes across experiences, discarding specifics in favor of useful abstractions. This is why sleeping on a problem often leads to insights. Your sleeping brain is making connections your waking mind missed. Even more fascinatingly, your brain continues predicting during sleep. In 2011, researchers at University College London recorded activity in rats' hippocampal place cells, neurons that fire when an animal is in a specific location. They found that during sleep, these place cells sometimes fired in sequences corresponding to routes the rat had never actually taken but that would logically connect familiar locations. The sleeping brain was essentially mapping possible future paths. This discovery aligns perfectly with the predictive processing framework. Even in sleep, your brain is using memory not to record the past but to anticipate the future. But if memory is fundamentally constructive and oriented toward the future rather than the past, we must confront an unsettling question. Is anything we remember truly reliable? The implications. Living with constructed memory, the scientific reality of memory creates an apparent paradox. Our memories feel intensely real and personal, yet they're demonstrably reconstructive and malleable. How do we reconcile these facts? And more importantly, how should this knowledge change how we live? Let's begin with the criminal justice system, where memory's limitations have their most dire consequences. Eyewitness testimony remains persuasive despite overwhelming evidence of its unreliability. Studies show that eyewitnesses who express high confidence are only marginally more likely to be correct than those expressing uncertainty. Yet juries find confident witnesses far more convincing. The problem is compounded by police procedures that can inadvertently contaminate witness memories. Traditional police lineups, for instance, where all suspects are viewed simultaneously, create an implicit comparative judgment rather than a recognition task. Witnesses tend to select the person who most resembles their memory relative to others present, not necessarily someone they actually recognize. Progressive jurisdictions have implemented research-based reforms. Some now require double-blind lineups, where the administering officer doesn't know which person is the suspect, sequential rather than simultaneous presentation of individuals, and explicit instructions that the perpetrator may not be present at all. These simple changes have reduced false identifications by 25% in some jurisdictions. But beyond legal settings, memory's reconstructive nature has profound implications for how we understand ourselves. Our autobiographical memories form the backbone of our identity. They tell us who we are, where we've been, what we've accomplished, and what we've endured. If these memories are constructions rather than recordings, what does that mean for the self? Consider the case of Zamir Idrisi, who suffered damage to his medial temporal lobes in a motorcycle accident in 2004. Zamir developed profound retrograde amnesia. He could not consciously recall most events from his life before the accident. Yet remarkably, his personality, values, and skills remained largely intact. He still loved jazz music, still had his quick sense of humor, still navigated social interactions with his characteristic charm, despite not remembering the experiences that shaped these traits. Zamir's case suggests something profound. We are not simply the sum of our explicit memories. Our identities persist in our procedural knowledge, our emotional reactions, our implicit biases and preferences, and our habitual ways of relating to others, all of which can operate independently of our ability to consciously recall specific experiences. This helps explain why people with Alzheimer's disease and other forms of dementia often maintain their core personality traits even as their memories deteriorate. The self isn't stored in episodic memories alone but distributed across multiple memory systems. Yet our autobiographical memories clearly matter for our sense of self-continuity. We use narratives about our past to make sense of our present and guide our future. If these narratives are constructions rather than recordings, does that make them less meaningful? Not necessarily. The constructive nature of memory means our life stories can evolve as we do. When we reinterpret past experiences in light of new understanding, we're not simply changing our view of fixed events, we're actually reconsolidating those memories with new meaning. This has profound implications for psychotherapy. Approaches like cognitive behavioral therapy work in part by helping people reconsolidate painful memories with new interpretations and associations. When therapy is successful, clients don't just think differently about traumatic experiences. Their memories of those experiences actually change. Even more radical interventions are on the horizon. In 2014, neuroscientist Daniela Schiller demonstrated that fearful memories could be modified during the reconsolidation window, the brief period after recall when memories are labeled. By having participants recall traumatic memories in a safe environment, then introducing new, positive associations during the reconsolidation period, Schiller's team effectively rewrote the emotional content of those memories. Some researchers have gone further, using drugs like propranolol, a beta blocker that dampens emotional arousal, during memory reconsolidation to reduce the emotional impact of traumatic memories. These approaches don't erase the memory itself but alter its emotional signature. These advances raise profound ethical questions. If memories are malleable constructions, is it wrong to deliberately reshape them? Does modifying painful memories constitute an authentic healing process? Or is it a form of self-deception? If someone uses reconsolidation techniques to transform a traumatic memory into a less painful one, are they escaping reality or creating a more adaptive relationship with their past? There are no simple answers to these questions, but they highlight that memory's reconstructive nature cuts both ways. It makes our memories less reliable as historical records but more adaptable for supporting our well-being and growth. The implications extend beyond individual psychology to collective memory and social dynamics. Just as individual memories are constructed and reconstructed over time, so too are shared cultural memories and historical narratives. Consider how different nations remember the same historical events. American textbooks describe the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki primarily as events that ended World War II and saved lives by preventing a land invasion of Japan. Japanese textbooks emphasize the civilian casualties and long-term suffering caused by radiation. Both accounts contain factual elements but construct different narratives by emphasizing different aspects and interpreting the same events through different frameworks. These collective memory constructions aren't just academic exercises. They shape national identities, influence international relations, and set precedents for future conflicts. Just as individuals reconsolidate memories with each recall, societies collectively reconsolidate their understanding of historical events with each retelling, each commemoration, each depiction in media and art. Understanding memory's constructive nature can make us more aware of these processes and more deliberate about how we shape both personal and collective narratives. But perhaps the most profound implication of modern memory science is how it changes our relationship with truth itself. If memory is inherently reconstructive, if even our most confident recollections are vulnerable to distortion, how can we trust anything we believe about our past experiences? This question has haunted memory researchers for decades. Elizabeth Loftus, whose work demonstrated how easily false memories can be implanted, has been subjected to death threats and harassment. Her findings challenge something fundamental about how we understand ourselves and our experiences. But the science doesn't suggest all memories are equally unreliable or that we should dismiss personal recollection entirely. Rather, it points to a more nuanced understanding of memory as probable rather than certain, as influenced by context and purpose rather than simply accurate or inaccurate. Memory researcher Charles Ferneyhoff suggests we think of memories not as replayed video but as reconstructed simulations, mental models built to serve current needs from available fragments of past experience. These simulations can be more or less accurate, more or less useful, depending on circumstances and purpose. This view aligns with emerging theories in cognitive science that see the brain fundamentally as a prediction machine. Under this predictive processing framework, perception itself is a kind of controlled hallucination, the brain's best guess about what's causing its sensory inputs, constrained by but not determined by those inputs. Memory, in this view, is not a separate system for storing information but part of the same predictive machinery that helps us navigate the present moment. When we remember, we're not retrieving stored content but generating a simulation based on prior experiences, current context, goals, and expectations. This framework helps explain phenomena like context-dependent memory, the fact that recall is better when the retrieval environment matches the encoding environment. It's not that memories are stored with contextual tags. It's that the context provides cues that help the brain reconstruct a more complete simulation. The predictive nature of memory also explains why we're prone to remember things that didn't happen but should have, based on our understanding of how the world works. In one famous study, participants shown lists of words like bed, rest, awake, tired, and dream, frequently remembered seeing the word sleep, even though it wasn't presented. Their brains were filling in the expected pattern. These aren't simply errors. They're features of a system designed to extract meaningful patterns from experience and use them to navigate future situations. Memory's goal isn't to provide a verbatim record, but to supply useful information when needed. This brings us back to the practical question. How should we live differently, knowing what we now know about memory? First, we might approach our own memories with more humility and curiosity. Rather than insisting that our recollections are accurate simply because they feel vivid, we can recognize them as reconstructions subject to revision. This doesn't mean distrusting all our memories but approaching them as hypotheses rather than facts, especially when they conflict with other evidence or others' recollections. Second, we can be more intentional about the conditions under which important memories are formed. If memories are constructed from what we attend to and how we interpret experiences, we can influence that construction through mindful attention and deliberate reflection. The practice of mental photography, taking a moment to consciously attend to all aspects of a significant experience, can enrich the materials available for later reconstruction. Third, we can develop more sophisticated approaches to preserving important memories. External memory aids like photographs, journals, and recordings don't just remind us of experiences. They provide scaffolding that constrains memory reconstruction. But they're most effective when they prompt us to actively reconstruct experiences rather than passively review them. Research shows that writing detailed accounts of meaningful events and periodically rereading and elaborating on them can significantly improve long-term recall. Finally, we might reconsider how we evaluate memory in educational contexts. Traditional tests often reward verbatim recall of information presented in specific formats. But if memory evolved primarily for prediction rather than reproduction, education might better focus on helping students develop flexible, applicable knowledge structures rather than memorize isolated facts. This doesn't mean abandoning knowledge acquisition. Prediction requires patterns extracted from experience. But it suggests emphasizing connected understanding over decontextualized memorization, application over reproduction, and conceptual frameworks over isolated facts. The final insight, memory as creation. As we've journeyed through the science of memory, we've moved progressively further from the storage and retrieval model taught in schools. We've seen that memory is reconstructive rather than reproductive, that it operates through multiple parallel systems with different rules and purposes, that it's oriented toward prediction rather than record-keeping, and that it's inextricably tied to perception, imagination, and identity. But there's one final insight that brings these threads together. Memory is fundamentally creative. When you remember, you aren't accessing a stored representation, you're creating a new experience. This creation draws on fragments of past experiences, current goals and beliefs, environmental cues, and predictive models of what might have happened or should have happened. It's a generative act, not a reproductive one. This creativity explains both memory's failures and its strengths. It explains why eyewitness testimony can be so unreliable yet so convincing. Witnesses aren't lying. They're creating experiences that feel real. It explains why reminiscing with others changes our memories. Collaborative remembering is collaborative creation. And it explains why memory is so deeply tied to imagination. Both involve constructing experiences that aren't directly present to the senses. The creative nature of memory also illuminates its deep connection to identity. We often think of memories as things we have, but in an important sense, they're things we are. The neural patterns that constitute your memories aren't separate from the neural patterns that constitute yourself. They're aspects of the same dynamic system. This perspective transforms how we understand conditions like dementia. When someone loses the ability to form or retrieve autobiographical memories, they aren't simply missing information. They're experiencing a fundamental shift in how their self is constituted moment to moment. Yet importantly, aspects of selfhood persist through procedural memory, emotional patterns, and embodied knowledge even when explicit recall fails. Understanding memory as creative also changes how we relate to collective or cultural memory. When societies commemorate historical events, they aren't simply preserving the past. They're actively creating shared meaning in the present. The choices about what to remember, how to remember it, and what significance to assign it are creative acts with real consequences for collective identity and behavior. Perhaps most profoundly, the creative nature of memory reveals something fundamental about human consciousness. We don't passively perceive the world and store representations of it. We actively construct our experience from the inside out, using prior knowledge to interpret sensory signals and generate meaningful predictions. Memory, in this light, isn't a system for preserving the past but a core aspect of how consciousness manifests moment by moment. When you experience the present, you're drawing on implicit predictions derived from past experience. When you remember the past, you're creating a new present experience. And when you imagine the future, you're recombining elements of constructed memory in novel patterns. Past, present, and future aren't separate domains accessed by different cognitive processes, but points on a continuum of constructed experience, generated by the same fundamental mechanisms. This unifying perspective helps explain phenomena like déjà vu, that uncanny feeling that a new experience has happened before. Rather than being a glitch where a new experience is mistakenly recognized as a memory, déjà vu may occur when the brain's prediction systems are temporarily misaligned with its reality testing mechanisms. The experience feels familiar because the brain has generated a strong prediction about what's happening, but the mismatch between prediction and actual sensory input creates the meta-awareness that something is unusual. Similarly, the phenomenon of memory flashes during life-threatening situations, where people report their life flashing before their eyes, may represent the brain rapidly generating simulations based on autobiographical knowledge, searching for any patterns that might help navigate the crisis. Even the structure of human storytelling reflects this creative memory system. The stories we tell follow patterns similar to how memory constructs experiences, selecting significant elements, arranging them in meaningful sequences, emphasizing emotional significance, and extracting themes and lessons. Our natural storytelling impulse may be an extension of the same systems that construct our memories and sense of self. Understanding memory as creative rather than reproductive doesn't diminish its value or make it less real. Creation isn't fabrication. It's generative construction constrained by experience. Your memories are no less yours because they're created anew each time you recall them. Indeed, their creative nature is what makes them uniquely yours, shaped by your history, your perspectives, your concerns, your emotional landscape. This creative view also offers hope for dealing with difficult memories. If memories aren't fixed recordings but constructions sensitive to context and meaning, then changing how we relate to painful experiences can genuinely transform how we remember them. Therapeutic approaches that help people reconstruct traumatic memories with new meanings and associations aren't simply changing interpretations of fixed events. They're participating in the natural creative process through which all memory operates. Perhaps most importantly, understanding memory as creative helps us appreciate our own role in shaping who we are through what we choose to attend to, how we interpret experiences, what stories we tell ourselves and others, and how we integrate new experiences into our existing frameworks of meaning. Your memories aren't happening to you, you're creating them. And through this ongoing creation, you're continuously creating yourself. The ultimate takeaway: memory isn't a repository of who you were, but a dynamic process of who you are becoming, continuously creating not just recollections of your past, but the very self that experiences them.